Hey guys, welcome back to the Func Med Nation podcast. This is going to be an installment in our Lab Spotlight series where we take some time out to talk to representatives from different labs that offer functional medicine testing. Today we're going to be talking to Dr. Kim Bruno from Vibrant Labs. Let me just give you a little bit of background before we get into the interview itself. Dr. Bruno received her doctorate in chiropractic medicine from National University of Health Sciences in Chicago, and then successfully completed her Certified Clinical Nutritionist Board exam. She's continued postgraduate education through the Institute of Functional Medicine and the Clinical Nutrition Certification Board. Dr. Bruno has dedicated her career to working to find root cause to patients' medical issues, as well as promoting a preventional model of health. Dr. Bruno is currently the Clinical Director of Outreach and Medical Science Liaison for Vibrant Wellness Lab, working to educate providers on the use of functional medicine lab tests for treating complex patients. Prior to working at Vibrant, she owned a private practice for 17 years and worked together with a variety of healthcare providers in multidisciplinary practices, and was functional medical director at the largest immunology clinic in Colorado. She is a Colorado native who enjoys hiking and paddleboarding and finds most joy in spending time outside in nature with her husband and 2 daughters. And without further ado, here's my interview with Dr. Bruno. Dr. Bruno, welcome to the podcast. I appreciate you taking time out to talk about you and your background, as well as Vibrant Health or Vibrant Labs. Like, how do you guys refer to yourself? Because I know you have like these 2 divisions. There's the Vibrant Wellness, and then there's the kind of more standard lab side. So internally, how do you talk about yourselves?
Yeah, so we're definitely, our branding is Vibrant Wellness. It has progressed, and there are different arms and divisions within Vibrant, but Vibrant Wellness is really going to be the overarching. And as we move forward, and especially since we are going more global, we're expanding across Mexico, Canada, into Europe. And so the Vibrant Wellness is that bigger overarching brand, more so than just Vibrant America.
Oh, that's awesome. And I want to come back to that. But before we talk more about the lab itself, why don't you give us a little bit of your background? Because, I mean, you're not just a representative for Vibrant and working in the clinician liaison department, if that's the right term.
Yeah.
But I know you've got a pretty rich history in functional medicine. I don't know. I couldn't tell from your bio if you're still practicing or if you've kind of transitioned your career strictly with that, but it kind of sounds like you still have your finger on things.
Yes.
So talk to me about your background. You and I are both chiropractors.
Yeah.
We both at some point moved into functional medicine. It's exclusively what I do and have done for, 15, almost 20 years now. So what's your story? Like, what's your origin story? How did you get to where you are? Where did you start?
Well, Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about this. And, origin story, I always think is funny because, you think of people's like how they got in their career as, a lot of times they think is like this linear line, but mine is definitely it's all over the place. And I will say that like I always knew I wanted to be in healthcare back when, and this is a pretty funny story, I'll keep it real short, but I would take my light bright and I would plug it into a like surge protector outlet in my dad's office and like press the reset button and make it into an x-ray machine. And I would blow out the circuit in my parents' house. And they would be like, "What are you doing down there?" I'm like, "Well, I'm x-raying my stuffed animals." They'd be like, "Well, I guess we can't really be mad at you for that, right?" So it's like I always knew funny. That I wanted to like be in healthcare. And I was pre-med, sports medicine in undergrad, and kind of just knowing I wanted to be there, but then at the same time, being fearful of things like the MCATs and organic chemistry and some of like the other things that were on my way to get to that path. So kind of roundabout way, I tackled organic chemistry, ended up loving it, biochem, and I really kind of found my niche. I loved biochemistry. I loved nutrition. So I knew I wanted to be in medicine, but I didn't want to just be in traditional medicine because I really wanted to bring in the nutrition aspect and the herbal aspect and the botanical aspect. I had a fantastic chiropractor who I was seeing for my own care, and she was already doing things like that. She was already doing the supplements, the herbals, treating at a more root cause, really before functional medicine had the term functional medicine. And so I ended up going to chiropractic school based on Dr. Julie and, being around her and really wanting to have a practice like hers. But as you know, being a chiropractor in functional medicine, it's not a straight shot, right? There's chiropractic schools that are much more musculoskeletal based and, some that are much more philosophy based and whatnot. And so I had to find my right fit. I ended up in National in Chicago, where it had a much wider view of chiropractic. I was able to get my CCN, which is a certified clinical nutrition, at the same time as my chiropractic degree, and I'm taking extra classes in botanicals and nutrition. So I really came out of school already doing that and knowing that I didn't want just a musculoskeletal practice, but I was utilizing that DC as like a jumping off point into, everything that we know is functional medicine now.
Yeah.
So then, throughout practice, I started pretty standard, food sensitivity tests and kind of some basics until all of a sudden you realize like, whoa, like that's just a symptom. Like now we got to go and start looking at the gut and the toxicities. And, it just starts layering back. 2014, my husband was diagnosed with Lyme, and that threw me into the Lyme chronic infections world, which I never thought that I was going to be in, but sometimes you just get thrown into the deep end of the pool and you have to learn. So I didn't treat him. I had a colleague treat him, but I learned kind of alongside her, as she was treating him. And then that just progressed into, I had Lyme patients in my office and I was working at an immunology clinic and seeing a lot of chronically ill patients, and everything just kind of leads one to another. And then I ended up working at Vibrant, and that was a lot through COVID. I got really burnt out working in the immunology office through a pandemic with chronically ill patients. Like it was just very taxing. And as anyone in healthcare knew that it was a taxing time, right? And so I knew that they were looking for some clinical positions at Vibrant, and I had been using their labs for a long time and transitioned over there. So I would say full-time at Vibrant. I still have my finger on the pulse of, I still communicate with past patients. There's still some that I talk to, who knows, I might always jump back in there, but we'll see. I'm pretty busy with just doing,
once it's in your blood, it's hard to get out, isn't it?
It is really hard. And I know like at that level of burnout, you're like, I'm not ever seeing patients again. And then about 2 years out of, being out of patient care, you're like, oh, I really miss my patients. I really want to go back and see them again. So who knows what the future might bring, as this continues to progress.
Yeah. It's, it's funny because I've done interviews with, people in different aspects of functional medicine, whether it's practitioners like Chris Turnpaugh we were talking about before we started recording, or PhDs and researchers from different fields of expertise. And it's so funny to listen, nobody's had that straight linear career path. Like everybody has told pretty much the same story, where I started out going in this direction and then something happened and I went this direction, and, step 8, 9, 10, and 12, and here I am right now.
Yeah.
So it's a familiar story, and I have one myself. I'm not going to bore everyone with it because I've told it before. So let's transition then into Vibrant, because, when I first heard about Vibrant, I've been on the functional medicine seminar speaking circuit, if you want to call it that, since about 2008. Vibrant wasn't around, or at least I wasn't aware of them at that point. To be honest, I can't remember what year it was where people in seminars that I was teaching started coming up and asking, like, have you heard about this lab called Vibrant and, some of the tests that they're running? And I hadn't, but, that was just my lack of awareness. So let's go back. I'm interested in a couple of things because I love origin stories, even from a lab. So I know that there's somebody behind, like someone somewhere said, hey, I want to open a lab. And I'd like to hear a little bit about that. We don't have to go into too much detail.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in one aspect of that story is that I have heard that Vibrant considers themselves more of a tech company than a lab, even though they clearly offer laboratory services. So how, as a practitioner, I'm going to try to put myself in the position of an average functional medicine practitioner who either doesn't know anything about Vibrant or maybe knows a little bit, but wants to know more information. So I'm going to try to put myself in that position. So what's the origin story of the lab, and why, if it is true, why does Vibrant consider itself a tech company rather than a laboratory services company?
Yeah. It is a great question. It's actually a really fun story. So in 2008, is when Vibrant was established. So you're right around your same timeline. And what happened was our CEO, everyone refers to him as JJ. So he was one of the head engineers that helped to develop the Intel processing chip. And this is all based on, they were working with Nikon, right? They were in the technology, Silicon Valley. They're creating this microchip for processing. And then he was actually started having some health issues. So similar to how you and I always say that, like, you tend to be going this way in your career, and then all of a sudden, like, you get derailed or you end up going in a different direction. He was also having some health related issues and was starting to, kind of mess around with this microchip that he had developed through Intel of like, can we use this for labs? And it really is about creating more reasonably priced labs with really high accuracy, because lab testing, if we think about like the standard methodology of labs, it hasn't been updated since the 70s. It's like we're still using ELISA testing, even though it's not always great as far as sensitivity, but like we've been using it, the same testing for a really long time. And so him and a group of colleagues who actually ended up being some of his students that he was teaching at a Bay Area school, and they developed the biochip. So they took this microchip and really determined it into this biochip to be able to do antibody testing, peptides, protein, microarrays. And then from there, everything just kind of grew out of that. They realized they could use it in various different levels. But that was really kind of the foundation story for Vibrant.
That's fascinating. It's interdisciplinary in the sense that it's the adoption of computer chip technology to laboratory services. So are you equipped to speak to actually how this works? I mean, for example, we could describe how an ELISA testing plate works.
Yeah.
Can you speak to, and if not, that's okay, but can you speak to actually how the chip works? Because in my brain, I'm going like, I have a very basic understanding of how microcomputer chips work.
Yeah.
But I have no idea how you bridge the gap between that and something that's in the world of biology.
Yeah. So, I mean, I will preface it with saying that, like, I am not a lab scientist, right? I definitely came from the clinical world.
Me either.
But I've had to learn a lot in the last 3 years that I've been here. So I can kind of at my level explain how a microchip works. What does it look
that's all
like?
I want.
So, yeah, perfect. And this is mostly what providers want to hear too, like, because most providers out in the field are also not laboratory scientists, right? We just want to kind of know, okay, generally, how does this work? Well, I'll give you the example of the difference in tick-borne testing, because that's what I know kind of at its deepest root as far as the differences in the methodology, okay? So an ELISA plate has 96 different wells, and in each well, you can put one protein. Usually on an ELISA plate, they're going to put the protein as VLSE1, and then you can only and then you put one patient sample per one well. Well, you're only testing one protein at that sense. And you're looking for, it's called chromogenetic detection, basically antibody antigen bind emission of light. That is indication that there is the antigen is there, the antibody is there, and we move forward, right? So that is kind of the ELISA plate. And then the Western blot, they're going to be separating out those different recombinant antigens by like molecular weight and charge. There can be some cross-reactivity because certain recombinant antigens within Lyme weigh and have a similar charge to, let's say, Epstein-Barr or some other viruses. Right. And so there can be a lot of cross-reactivity. So if we think about—
And when you say, I'm sorry to interrupt, but just for clarity, when you say cross-reactivity, you mean like false positives?
Correct, right. So like, let's say band 41 on a Western blot lights up. That very well could be because the person has been exposed to Epstein-Barr before. And far more people in the world have Epstein-Barr than, let's say, have Lyme. So you're going to get a lot of positives on your band 41, which aren't necessarily Lyme, right? If you're looking at a traditional Western blot. So when we bring in the microchip, what it does, and just kind of running through the steps. So it takes these like silicon wafers, it attaches one protein to the wafers and then dices it up into these tiny chips. So when the chip goes onto the pillar, that is the only thing that there's no chance of cross-reactivity, because once they're still looking for an emission of light. We just use something that's called chromatography, but which is much more sensitive. And so we're looking at that emission of light, but there's no chance of cross-reactivity. And then, excuse me, to overcome kind of the ELISA idea that you can only have one protein per well per these big, massive plates, is that our chips are 2 millimeters by 2 millimeters, and we can put 100 different proteins on that. So with a couple drops of blood, you can test all these different recombinant antigens, co-infections, all these different viruses, all the different, bands within Borrelia species. And so you all of a sudden have really increased the antigen, types that you can look for, as well as increasing the sensitivity and increasing the specificity, right? We're decreasing the amount of cross-reactivity. So it's just a whole nother level. Now, it's a completely different methodology. So, this idea of like, well, let's just compare test to test is like, we are comparing apples to oranges in some sense. We have different reference ranges and that type of thing. But we are still looking for, an antibody antigen binding in an emission of light. We're just doing it on a chip versus like a protein well or a gel matrix like they would on a Western blot.
So you said something earlier, and you kind of hinted at it as you were going through that description, and thank you for that. In JJ, the founder of Vibrant, you said that one of his goals was to help reduce the cost of diagnostics. Mm-hmm. And so I can imagine, and I guess that's where technology comes in, because I would imagine in developing tests that are more sensitive, more specific, those have a higher cost than things that are less sensitive and less specific. And maybe I'm naive and that's not really how it works. But was this balance between cost and accuracy, was that one of the driving forces when JJ said, hey, I think we can, bridge this technology with this technology and create something that's really, truly disruptive in the business space? Because, and I, when I shot my ideas about this conversation to you, I had kind of floated this idea that my impression of Vibrant, and I've used Vibrant for several years now. I don't use them for everything. I use them for very specific things. But it seems to me that when a practitioner uses Vibrant Labs, they get more information for less money.
Yes.
Right. So is that part of the mandate? Is that, part of the mission and the vision at the executive level with Vibrant, that this is a stated intent, or is this just a happy coincidence?
I would say I mean, obviously, I'm not at the board meetings at the top, but the couple times that I have met with JJ, I've met with Vasant. They are verbalizing it. We want to be able to offer more for less. Now, so many times in our kind of like practitioner mind, we're like, well, then what's wrong, right? Like if you're offering more and it costs less, like there's something wrong. Like, am I getting discount sushi here? Like, what's happening? And it's
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
you
Yes.
know, it's more that because of the technology, we can have smaller spaces. We don't have to have these huge, massive labs. So we're already cutting down on costs there. The machines are completely automated, right? This chip or this pillar plate, which I know you guys can't see what I'm saying, but it's like maybe the size of like a CD case. And on that, you have 100 pillars, and each pillar is a patient, and then each chip can have up to 100 different antigens. So on one plate the size of a CD, we can run 100 patients who have 100 different lab markers each, right? So we're just scaling things to a level that's not possible when traditional labs are having to have big machines and have, they can only test one protein per one plate. So now they need big machines, big lab spaces. They need technicians to run all of those things. Like ours are all automated. Everything is run, without really like human interpretation. So when you cut a lot of those things out, yes, the technology is expensive, but you're cutting costs in a lot of other ways. And then the really exciting thing is that we can continue to add. So let's continue our conversation with tick-borne. The more we discover more Borrelia species or more co-infections, we can easily add them on there. We don't have to like build out a whole nother unit to be like, oh, we got to test, this whole other subset of pathogens over here. We can just add another little chip or another little protein onto the chip. So that is helpful. And then just like any other technology, whether we're talking cell phones, computers, whatever, the more that we use things and scale them, the cheaper they become over time, right? Like if I would have told you that like this cell phone, we would have been able to even have this 20 years ago, like all of us would have been like, what? Like my computer is like this big on my desktop. I can't, and I can do all the same functionality I can, and prices come down. So I think that it's a really exciting time for technology in the lab space because it will offer more to patients, more information. And when patients and providers have more information, they have better root cause medicine to be able to get them the right treatment, right? We're not just guessing.
Is this technology something that Vibrant holds patents on, or can we expect other labs to start adopting this? And here's why I ask this. I don't know if you were in practice back when Metametrics came on the scene and started doing PCR-based stool testing. And this, they operated independently for a few years before Genova bought them out. And at the time, all the labs that were doing either standard microscopy, like culture microscopy, or they were doing like Molotov, they were all looking at PCR technology going, oh, this doesn't work for stool. And so there was this animus between kind of like the old guard using gold standard, already accepted technology, and the new guy on the block. And now most labs that are doing high level stool testing are at least using PCR to, parse out the microbiome, if not doing it for the entire assay. And maybe we can come back and talk about specific. I know you've said a few things about the tick-borne testing, but I think at the end of the conversation, I'd like to just toss some questions to you about specific things, whether it's the tick-borne, the mycotoxins, the viral panels, or even the stool testing, the gut zoomer that you guys do. Let me come back to this idea. Like, is this patented technology? Is this something that is not patented, or it is patented, but Vibrant is going to license the technology? Are we going to start to see this being adopted by other labs?
So the microchip technology, protein microarray and peptide microarray is proprietary and patented to Vibrant. I will tell you that people are trying to figure out how it works, and I don't know. I don't know all about patent law and all of that, but when I give a presentation out in the world, a lot of times some of our biggest competitors are the people who are sitting in the front row, like trying to like figure it out, right? So that the chip part is absolutely patented. Now, PCR, we use PCR too for our stool test, right? Like you mentioned, lots of other people do PCR. So we have kind of three different, where we have four technology pillars: the protein microarray, peptide microarray, those are patented to us. We have PCR. The PCR that we do, what we add to it is we do multiple gene sequencing rather than just specific genes. And we're also going to do bead beading, which basically means it's going to come in and agitate the sample with glass beads to break up biofilms to better access the genetic material. So those things are not proprietary to us. Other lab companies could do that too. And then our last thing with is like the urinary mycotoxins and those types of tests, we use mass spec for. And mass spec is also not proprietary to us. We do have the highest level of machinery so that we can detect parts per quadrillion, which is the best in the industry. But lots of other people use mass spec as well. And so that one's maybe not proprietary to us. So, I mean, I can't say 100% that we would never see any other type of lab, offering something coming through as far as a microchip goes, but it wouldn't be exactly the same as the microarray that we're offering.
Yeah. Yeah. I shared a quote with you, and you may have heard it before. It was a German philosopher basically was saying that, the evolution of truth happens in different stages. First, it's ridiculed, then it's rigorously opposed, and then it's accepted as self-evident.
Mm-hmm.
And metametrics and the PCR testing and stools seem to have followed that. And I remember back in, I don't know, maybe 2012 or so, when I started doing calcium heart scores in clients that had cardiovascular risk. Back then, the calcium heart score, the high-speed CT scan for that purpose was actively being opposed.
Mm-hmm.
And now you can get them done at pretty much any hospital, and a lot of cardiologists do this as part of the routine evaluation. So, I would hope a couple of things. I would hope that, for the sake of our field, and I'm speaking just strictly as a clinician, I would hope that the technology enjoys wider adoption. But I understand that Vibrant would want to keep a competitive advantage, right? Because it is a good thing for me and my clients to have access to accurate information with more information at cheaper cost. Like, that's a deal I'll take pretty much any day. Is there a team that is actively looking to disrupt other current gold standards like mass spec, or are they just kind of satisfied with where they are right now and say, okay, we're clearly the disruptors with the proprietary technology? We're just going to leave everything else alone because we're doing enough. Or are you guys actively trying to figure out how to do all those other things better as well?
I think our effort is more in utilizing the technologies we have to further increase the testing offerings. So to my knowledge, there isn't a trying to develop, a different or better type of, let's say, mass spec or different or better type of PCR. But we are going to use the testing that we have to measure things that have never been able to be measured before. And actually, we're launching a test this month that will do that. We're going to be able to measure damaged products of oxidative stress, actual direct measurements, right? Like that's revolutionary in and of itself, of being able to say exactly what is the level of oxidative stress that's happening in this patient's body, and be able to measure it, make lifestyle changes, measure it again, get extra data points. And so we're going to be able to use that. That's a urine test. We'll be using mass spec for that to measure those. So
and is that, sorry to interrupt, but again, just for clarity, and maybe because you haven't rolled it out, you can't tell me, but are you talking about looking at F2 isoprostanes and 8-hydroxydeoxyguanosine. Is that what you're talking
Well,
about? Or are you talking about something different?
8-OHDG, we've been testing for a long time, right? Like we have that on our total tox test, on our urinary hormones test. Like that's a pretty standard marker out in the functional medicine space. This one, and just give me a second. So we're going to be looking at, there's actually 18 different damaged products. I can just give you the categories of what those are going to be. So we're going to be looking at like advanced glycation products, DNA damage, protein oxidation, lipid peroxidation tests. And so within each one of those, we're going to have several different markers that we'll look at. And so watch our blog and watch, there's going to be a provider webinar, and I think it's maybe in 2 or 3 weeks, that's going to introduce all of the different markers on that. It also will be paired with a genetic component. So we're going to be looking at 20 different genetic SNPs that have to do with the mutations or variation SNPs within the pathways that have to do with glutathione, with detoxification, with levels that might be producing or hindering oxidative stress. So that's going to be the test that's going to be bundled together to give people kind of a big picture of their oxidative stress there. So that is really where they're looking. They're looking into that, how do we use our technology to bring tests to the market that have never been there before, to give providers more information on how to test. I know for me, I'm excited about the oxidative stress because it's like, it gives me a better idea of, how much of an impact is the glycocalyx taking from oxidative stress when, before we've always said, well, the glycocalyx is really, is susceptible to oxidative stress damage, but we don't know what the actual markers are. And this can help to give us.
We couldn't quantify that.
Yeah. So
and with the, I know that you gave me the general categories. Are there, in that particular test, I have 2 questions. One is, are there things that are very specific to mitochondria? And number 2, as you're bundling together these urinary markers and some genomics, is the stated intent of that bundle to marry pieces of data that by themselves may not have as much value as when you view them together? For example, I'm not a huge fan of doing a bunch of SNP testing just as a matter of course, because as you and I, we both know that you can carry a gene, but if it's not expressing, it's a problem. But if you see a gene with, you have polymorphisms in glutathione pathways or whatever, and then you see the evidence of that in the same test, and you pair those 2 things together, it makes a lot more sense than if you're just looking at a gene report and some third-party interpretation, which I've always found very lackluster, to be honest. So is that part of it? Is there now we're looking at disparate pieces of data and try to put them together in the same place so it makes sense clinically?
And that's exactly it, because, even if you think of something like nutrigenomics, right? Like we look at all these genes that have to do with different types of nutrient absorption and conversion. But if you're not measuring the actual nutrient level, it's just a SNP, right? Your body could be creating a genetic bypass, a workaround. You could be having enough of that nutrient in your system, whatever. So the same idea is that, and that is also an initiative of the company, is that as we are bringing tests to market, we are going to try and bring the genetic information with the real-time labs so that you can see okay, this person has this SNP, it's heterozygous, and look, the damaged product is completely within range. They are overcoming, right? They either have enough antioxidants or they don't live in a toxic enough environment or whatever, whatever the pathway is, their body is overcoming that potential genetic risk. Versus if their marker is skyrocketed, well, now we know, okay, not only do we know the marker is high, we got to figure out what's going on environment-wise, but they also have a genetic predisposition. Can we manipulate that pathway? Can we bring in certain cofactors to help push that pathway better? And so there is going to be this push of genetics with real-time information, which ultimately bring to life the patient's labs. We see it in nutrigenomics, we see it in cardiogenetics. We have a test on cardiac genetics, but if you don't pair it with advanced cardiovascular markers to be able to see what actually is happening with inflammation and ApoB and whatnot, then the genetics are just the genetics. So I think you're going to start to see a lot more of this bringing personalization with real-time levels together, so the providers get that what's happening right now, and also maybe what's the big picture and how can we affect that patient's health in the future.
Yeah, remind me. Well, let me ask you this question. I'll come back to the mitochondria because I asked the question, then we went down the other pathway. But no, this is wonderful. So it's a much more intelligent and clinically relevant way to look at data, right?
Yeah.
To put those pieces together the way that you're describing. Where does that come from? Does that come from, for example, JJ or other people at the executive level being more lateral rather than linear thinkers, going, how do we make sense of data and put pieces together? Or do you guys have a pipeline where you float ideas to clinicians and clinicians can say, well, this is great by itself, this is okay by itself, but if you put them together, it's much better? Or do you have kind of both of those people inside that are generating ideas and then going to clinicians like yourself or me and saying, does this make sense to you as a practitioner? Like what's the mechanism? How is Vibrant listening to people like us that are out in the trenches?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a combination for sure. A lot of things come, and then we'll have a pilot group of, okay, let's look at this, pilot group, beta test, however you want to kind of look at that. And then we work through it on the clinical team and giving feedback. This makes sense. This doesn't make sense, that type of thing. So I would say a good percentage of it is kind of from the top down. And then once there's a good working panel or presentation, it's filtered out to some clinicians to get some feedback before it will come to market. And I don't know, I think a lot of times from what I can tell, and again, I'm not there in the board meeting, but what, I think they're paying attention to, the healthcare space of the future. What's coming down the line, right? It's all about things like longevity, post-COVID, of course, there's a big emphasis on chronic infections, what's going on. And then in the longevity space, what are all the hallmarks of aging? And then trying to make sure we have pieces in there. So something like oxidative stress makes sense there. Because we've already really covered the foundations, right? The foundations of functional medicine, gut testing, hormone testing, toxin testing, like we have kind of the basics. You are going to start seeing genetics added in there. We've added toxin genetics. We're going to add some GI genetics into some of the tests we already have. And then after that, it's going to be going really towards that, healthcare of the future, longevity space, and, pulling together testing that makes sense with hallmarks of aging and, improved patient outcomes.
Yeah. So back and thanks for that. Back to the question on the new urinary test that's coming out. Are there any markers that are, very specific to that? Because the 8-OHDG, certainly a lot of that, if there is a positive result, is coming from mitochondria, but it may be coming from other sources. And so how do you parse out whether or not we're seeing some kind of a mitochondrial damage and dysfunction? So will we have access to things that are very specific to that?
Not on this test. Not on this one. We are not going to have a specific mitochondrial marker. I do, in various meetings, have heard that it is being worked on. But as of right now, we're still like everybody else being like trying to get to that mitochondrial test. The providers want it. And there is one, I was just at IHS in New York 2 weeks ago. There was one vendor there who is starting to offer, and I didn't actually stop by their booth, marketed as like a mitochondrial test. And you might know who I'm talking about. I'm trying to think of the name. But from my understanding, it was like very, very few markers and, like $1,000, something that, from a provider perspective, I'm like, I can kind of already tell this person has mitochondrial dysfunction. Do I really need to spend $1,000 to like know that?
Yeah.
So I'm hopeful that when we get that to that point of we are able to make a mitochondrial test, that we make it as, either adding it into the oxidative stress panel as an analyte or having it be a test that is not so outrageously expensive that the providers are like, well, I kind of already know clinically, so I'm not going to use the money for that testing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, and I appreciate that certainly from a business standpoint. All right, let me kind of toss a few questions at you that let's say they fall under the miscellaneous category.
Okay.
And then I do want to talk about some of the I'm going to call them bigger tests that you run. We'll get to that here in a second, but one of the things I remember when I first started doing or using Vibrant, I was a little thrown off by the reporting ranges, the reference ranges, particularly on things like, the viral panels, or let's say the neural zoomer, or the tick-borne testing. And I showed the report to a friend of mine who's a PhD immunologist. And he's like, well, how can they do that? Because I asked him, I said, what is the lab doing? Are they taking the traditional laboratory reference ranges and then doing some kind of a mathematical conversion? And for anybody listening who may not have used Vibrant before, can you describe for them what the reporting range format is, numerically and by descriptor? And then I have a specific question about what does that represent? And I don't want to preface it yet. So can you describe what the reporting ranges are? Then I'll ask my question, and then we can delve into why you guys do it that way, because it is quite different than what most labs are doing.
Yeah, it is. So, and that really comes back down to the technology. So when you use a microarray, when you use a peptide or protein microarray, there's not a standard reference range like an ELISA reference range, or like, some of the other reference ranges that we would see on kind of standard testing. And so the reference range becomes that if you're from 0 to 10, when you're looking at a test, that's going to be coded as green. And that is really called, from the laboratory scientists that I talk to, they're like, this is immune system noise, right? So like if somebody has a 5, it's still coded as green, but it's because there's these lower levels of maybe some binding or immune system, like white noise in the background, right? It's not the door slamming, the big, like, we found something, but there's like some white noise back there just because everybody has a lot of IgGs in their system, IgMs in their system, like we've got immune cells that are there and other factors too that could be kind of like disrupting, causing some noise. Okay. So that's an important piece, because a lot of times I'll hear from providers, well, if it's not there, why isn't it just 0, right? Like, why is it 5? Is that significant? Does that mean something? And it's like, no, it's really noise. At 10 to 20.
And let me get your, I'm sorry to interrupt. I keep interrupting you. My apologies. Okay. I've always explained that, like, again, and I've taught hundreds of blood chemistry courses and courses where we touch on immunology, and quite often get that, like, what's the functional range for certain antibodies? I'm like, well, there really isn't, but the expectation that you're going to have 0 antibodies is unrealistic, because to my understanding and knowledge, there is always a background level of, and for anyone who's listening on the podcast, I'm using air quotes, autoimmunity, in the sense that you're going to generate antibodies just in the routine process of cleaning up your cellular environment, right? Because your immune system is going to be exposed to sequestered proteins. And so a certain small degree, what your scientists are calling background noise, a certain very low level of autoimmunity is part of normal immune balance and control. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Our immune systems are interacting in our environment constantly, every day, to everything. So but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's an issue there. It just means that it's active
Right.
and it's working. So yeah, same idea is that there's that level there. That means that it, which is why it's not zero. And we don't want it to be zero, right? I mean, we would have a big problem if we had zero antibodies in our system.
That's right. You'd probably be dead.
Yeah, correct. So,
all right, so that's the 0 to 10.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's the 0 to 10. Yellow. So what about the 10 to 20?
So 10 to 20, and this in kind of like, bell curve standard deviation. When I talk to the scientists about like, what does it mean as far as like healthy populations, they always say it's like the 10 to 20 is at the 95th percentile cutoff, right? So 95th to 97.5, and it's a pretty small range. That is going to be where your yellows are, right? So now this person has higher amounts of antibodies. Now, depending on which, is it an IgM versus IgG, it could mean something different, right? And a moderate IgG just means that, well, they've been exposed to it. They have maybe higher amounts of memory cells. Doesn't necessarily mean they have an active infection there or, something that's going on that we need to treat, but it's like, it's there. Versus maybe an IgM, maybe they had a higher infection and the body's working to clear it out, right? It's working to seroconvert it over to IgG, or it's kind of on its way down. It's a little bit hard to say when it's just one data point, but you're looking at that kind of mid-range antibody level. Now, these are, again, microchip, units, if you will. It's kind of an arbitrary unit. So it's not apples to apples with what you're going to be seeing. But if you wanted a percentage cutoff as it compares to like an ELISA, your 10 to 20 is going to be your 95th to your 97.5 of healthy cohorts. Okay.
Right. So in reality, what this does is it kind of roughly translates to anything reported as green being less than 10 is within one standard deviation of the mean. Mm-hmm. Anything that's 10 to 20 that's coded as yellow is between 1 and 2 standard deviations of the mean. And we, quite often go, well, sometimes that's clinically relevant, sometimes it's not.
Correct.
And then anything in the red zone that's greater than 30 arbitrary units is greater than 2 standard deviations with the mean, which again, kind of, it approximates the standard laboratory reference range of defining anything abnormal as outside a 2 standard deviation above and below the mean. So it's kind of pretty standard, but it's just reported in a different way that, in the beginning I found confusing until I started to go, okay, I think this is what they're doing. So it's nice to get confirmation that that's exactly what it is. So on the tails of that, and linking back to something that I just said, from a clinician standpoint, and maybe I could ask what your scientists believe, but they don't have the clinical background that you have. But if you put your clinician hat on for a moment, let's say that you have somebody who we run, let's call it the neural zoomer, and we're looking at an array of both viral test results and a series of neurological antibody results. And you have a handful of things that are in the yellow zone, like kind of in that no man's mm-hmm. land, which I just said, could be clinically relevant, could be not. Would you assign, and let's just again point out the numerical values, between 10 and 20 is that yellow zone, no man's land that might be clinically relevant. Is there any circumstance where you would look at a value that's maybe 12.2, and I'm just making up numbers, and to say that that's more clinically relevant than a value that's 18.9? They're both in the yellow zone, but one's at the bottom and one's at the top. Mm-hmm. Is there any time when a lower value is more clinically relevant and becomes a clinical target than something that has a higher value?
Because it will all come down to clinical correlation, right? If you have somebody who has, let's say they have an anti-cerebellum at marker at 12, right? And they're having clinically obvious symptoms, right? They're having balance issues, gait abnormalities. They're having those symptoms that make me think that that's significant, versus, a different marker that doesn't necessarily correlate as much to their clinical, I would go forward with that. Like anytime we're looking at antibody testing, it is an indirect test, right? We are testing antibodies. We're looking at how the immune system is responding to a certain antigen. We're not measuring the actual antigen. So you are always going to have to make that clinical correlation in what you think is significant. And when it's within that 10 to 20 range, it's possible that, a 12 becomes significant just based on how the patient is presenting to you.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in classic example, in fact, just before we got on this morning, I got a notice that one of the labs I ordered through Vibrant was available. So I quickly jumped in to take a look. And I have this lady who had 3 positive results on a viral panel. They were all IgG within that yellow zone.
Right.
So maybe relevant, maybe not. And some of them were at the bottom end of the range, some were at the top. And so I think exactly the same way that you do. It all comes down to clinical correlation. But, on just to kind of continue that thought process, just because something's in the red zone, would you say automatically that is clinically relevant, or do you still go to clinical correlation? Because I've seen people in active autoimmune flares where the antibodies related to that particular system or problem were normal. And I've seen people with, red zone findings that have no clinical symptomatology. So it's almost like everything has to be clinically interpreted, right? And if I could put something out there for anyone listening who might be new to functional medicine, it always comes down to clinical correlation. Red, green, or yellow, it doesn't really matter, right? If you don't see evidence of the problem, then it's not there. But it's nice when things correlate, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
On the
I would say yes. I mean, for sure, it is always going to come down to clinical correlation. And it also is going to depend that kind of like IgM versus IgG, and it also depends on what is the level of immune system compromise or immune system shift this patient has. Because if their immune system has been hijacked by, like, let's say whatever infection they might have, or, they're dealing with high amounts of autoimmunity, or they have low total immunoglobulins, like all of that has to come into account when we're now measuring the immunoglobulins related to that particular antigen. So it is, it's a test to help us say, like, okay, what is the immune system seeing? Is that relevant? Does it make sense? Right? And how do we kind of then use that? I know how I use it a lot in clinical practice is, I take my history and I've already come up with what I think is going on, and I'm using the lab as like confirmatory, right? It's helping to say, like, and so when the lab comes back, I'm like, oh, well, yeah, I knew I was going to see Babesia because I already knew that but now I can confirm it, right? And I think a lot of that really comes from that IgG. When I see a high IgM, I know that the person is throwing those Marines in there. They've got some active immune system response. And so there's going to be something I'm going to kind of head towards more than, those IgGs, we're just going to have to kind of clinically correlate it all the way through.
Yeah. And thank you for pointing that out. I should have pointed that out when I was going on my little soapbox there for a second, that, that it's always clinical correlation is far more important. Well, it's always important, but you're right. When you see the IgM elevations, particularly in the red zone, it's like that's almost always your bullseye. Yeah. Almost always, right?
Yeah. Hold on. One quick.
Okay. So please go ahead.
I'm sorry. My puppy decided that she didn't want to be in the office anymore.
Oh, that's okay. No, not a problem at all. So, what you guys offer a lot of different testing. Like you guys run the gamut from just regular blood work to many different specialty tests. You pretty much run the gamut of what is considered standard testing in the functional medicine world, like meaning specialty testing. What do you guys think that you do really, really well compared to other labs? And putting the more information for less money and scale, put that aside. What do you guys think that you do really, really well that other labs don't?
Yeah. It's hard to pick because we do, you're absolutely correct. We have such a wide array of tests. Couple things. Our signature test, the test we came to market with, was the wheat zoomer. This was a test that we did particular validation with the Mayo Clinic as being able to identify celiac disease 18 months to 4 years ahead of even endoscope and microvilli damage. So I feel like when we are looking at being able to get that level of sensitivity from a non-invasive test, that I feel we do extremely well. So a zoomer, if somebody just is trying to, figure out like, what does that mean? It just means you're zooming in, right? So like when most food sensitivity tests are looking at a big 3D structure of a protein molecule, water-soluble protein molecule, we are looking at the individual peptides. So the best way I explain it to my patients is like a ball of yarn versus the actual yarn, right? Like if you're sensitive to something that's on the inside of the ball of yarn, but you only test the outside of the ball, you're not going to get a positive, right? You're going to get these false negatives and whatnot. Versus if you
that's a great analogy. I like that.
And you test along the entire length of every single one of those peptides, now you can get that level of sensitivity. So that was our signature test. That's what we came to market with. Now we have, 11 different zoomers, anything from corn to milk and nuts and everything else. So people can really see that. So I think that I would always say that we do that really, really well because we've been doing it the longest, and we have a lot of validations with external, organizations that hold this to a very high standard. I also go ahead.
No, because I wanted to go back to the validation question. So finish your thought, but I would like to ask you about the validation studies.
Sure, absolutely. So I also think, just from a functional medicine perspective, I think we do the gut testing really well because we offer so many commensals, so many pathogens, so many inflammatory markers. I know when I was in kind of traditional practice and running stool tests where I would like just get a calprotectin and it came back negative, but you're like, oh gosh, I know this person's like super inflamed in their gut. Well, we offer 8 different inflammatory markers, right, that are much more specific for other things. So I always say, if you know why the car broke down, it's easier to fix it. So if I know why the reason why they have inflammation is because of mycotoxins and their MMP9 is off the charts, their calprotectin may be normal, but now I have a little bit more information. So I think that the comprehensive nature of our gut zoomer really lays out that kind of 5R gut healing framework. You can pair those together and get a pretty foolproof treatment plan for your patient because you know exactly what to do in each section of those R's. Yeah.
And I have another question based on what you just said, and we'll get back to the validation question, I promise. One of the things that I've seen a trend in diagnostic companies over the years since I've been doing functional medicine is the inclusion of more and more detail. Right. And as a clinician, I kind of have a love-hate relationship with it, right? I love data, I love information, but there seems, and I'm talking more specifically about, say, the microbiome. It seems to me that there's a level of detail that really has no impact on clinical choices because we're limited in our ability to, with fine-tuned precision, manipulate a single species or family of probiotics. And so, and again, I'm just kind of asking about how things work inside in the lab, like the discussions, like, do you guys have the attitude that more information is better? Or is there any discussion about, okay, we could show this level of detail, but what's the practical utility? I mean, it's not there. Why show it? Because it can confuse the practitioner. It certainly can confuse the patients once they start looking at the labs.
Yeah.
So what's your official stance as a Vibrant representative, and is that different than what you might tell me if you were just talking strictly as a clinician?
Yeah. So I absolutely agree. Sometimes we lose the forest for the trees. What I think Vibrant does a good job about is like, we want to let the provider decide, we want to put all the information out there, but then we want to put it in a way that is more easily digestible. So like if we think about the gut zoomer in particular, yes, the test itself is 20 something pages long, right? It's a lot of data. It is a lot of information, but they summarize all of what really is like important as far as maybe that 5R protocol, and in a very nice, concise way to the patient in the first 4 pages.
Right.
Okay. So now we have these, and they'll bring groups of information together. So groups of commensals, let's say, that all have to do with cardiovascular health, or all have to do with inflammation or IBS or gut intestinal permeability or whatnot. And they lump them together and give them like a total score. So now, like if you as a provider or what you're presenting to your patient, you don't want them to lose the forest for the trees. I often would only present the first 4 pages to my patients. They're welcome to have all 20 pages of the test if they would like, but I'm going to present to them in my report of findings, the first 4 pages, and we're going to talk about the significance of these different sections. And then as far as just like adding a marker just to add it, like just because we can measure, this commensal, then we should definitely add it. The team definitely looks for clinical correlation. We have something on our test called the star rating. And so they'll look at a particular commensal. They will search the literature of what is the significance of that commensal. And normally, this commensal has a lot of significance in SIBO overgrowth or, intestinal permeability or whatnot. And then you'll see on the report, there's a star rating, anything from 2 stars to 5 stars. And that really, the star rating comes down to how many research articles and the strength of the research in its association with that clinical state. So it's not that we're just putting commensal A out there. We're saying this is the measurement of commensal A. And with, our star rating of, let's say 4, which is a strong star rating, it has high correlation with SIBO. So even though it's not a SIBO breath test, the provider can start looking and saying, okay, we have these associations. And we do have that spreadsheet that if our provider is so willing and they want to look at all of the research that goes into the star ratings, like we absolutely will provide that. Like we are an open book of what goes into our testing. But I think that they're trying to pull together the idea of like, yes, we can measure it. Is it significant? Does it help the provider? And try and pull that together. It still is a lot of information.
And, that's
a lot to wait for.
It is. Yeah, it is. And so just again, to kind of point out some nuances here is that seems to me, first of all, those are correlations, not causations, right? So if someone's stool test and report says, commensal X is associated with insulin resistance and diabetes, doesn't mean that person has it or will have it. So it's almost like the genomic stuff, like, okay, you have the SNP, but is that actually translating into real life? Right. And that's where it gets really dicey, either with, say, new practitioners, either new to Vibrant or just new to functional medicine, may not catch that right away, but certainly patients. Like if you give them that whole data dump and they'll start looking at all these things and they'll go, okay, well, the report says that I have or I'm going to have Alzheimer's.
Right.
Not necessarily true. Right. So I like the idea of being selective in what information. There's a part of me that says, well, the information's there in the report. I should give it to you because you paid for it. But I have to stand as a guardian between the information overload that may happen on their end and being able to give them a good, clear understanding of what the report is actually telling us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we actually just giving you more information about what's to come. I do know that IT is working on providers' ability to choose the type of report that goes out. So you can choose, do you just want the summary report to go to the patient? Do you want the summary report and report comments, or do you not want any report comments? Like how do you want this formatted for your patients? And you as the provider get all the information.
Yeah, before you and I connected, when I was talking to Caesar, I said that to him. I was like, I just wish labs would be labs. And I wish the labs wouldn't put all the interpretative stuff there, because the lab and the software that generates the blurb doesn't know the history of the patient. It doesn't know what's actually happening. And so I just like, give me the information. I just want the data. I don't want all this extra stuff, because that too becomes very confusing on many occasions. Not so much with data that I've gotten from Vibrant, but from other labs. People will come back to me and say, well, why aren't we doing anything about this? Right? They'll see something in the report, and the lab says, well, if you have this, you should be doing all these different things. And they come to me going like, well, did you miss it? Like, do you not know what you're doing? That kind of makes me look silly, right? Like I don't know what I'm doing. All right, let's go back to the validation. And I should have asked you when we started, do we have a hard stop in terms of your time today?
I would say at the bottom of the hour.
Okay, just so we got another 15 minutes or so.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, perfect. So let's go back to the validation, because I know that this is in the early years when I first discovered Vibrant. I heard a lot of people, some of whom have affiliations with other labs, so that's important, saying things like, well, they only have their own internal validation, and that's not worth anything. So as an uninformed clinician who doesn't really understand the inner workings of the laboratory world, how would you address someone's concerns that other people affiliated with labs or other labs that are using kind of gold standard technology are making light of the fact that you have your own proprietary technology and you've done your own internal validation and maybe not necessarily third-party validation?
So first of all, I will say we've done both. Any good lab is going to internally validate what's coming in, right? I mean, you're going to test it internally first, because you're going to be like, okay, we want to make sure that our technology is working. And you can absolutely access our validation reports, which are internal validations. But we go a step further, and we have I actually have, it's called our manuscript document, and I'm happy to, put this out to anybody. It is available in provider portals. But we have 4 pages of third-party validations, and we have industry collaborators. Why is that word sounding weird in my mouth? Right. We've collaborated with industry leaders, such as, like I mentioned, the Mayo Clinic earlier, your University of Washington, Columbia University, Georgia Tech, Scripps Integrative Health. Like, we've definitely worked with industry leaders to come out with third-party publications. And so we have both. And that, I think, is something to really be proud of. And our owners are very invested in that. Before they would put money into like big flashy marketing, they're going to want to do another study, have another publication, put more information out there to be third-party validated. But we have both. So there absolutely is, we're not just standing on the sense that like, well, we tested it internally and it's fine. We definitely have gone to both of those. And then I will also say, as far as like the internal validations, we have a CAP accreditation. We've had it since 2015. We've been recertified every single year, so we've never lost it, which means that when we do an internal validation, we're doing it at a level that's higher than other functional medicine labs. Most other functional medicine labs just have a CLIA accreditation or CLIA certification. A CLIA certification in the lab world is ultimately like having a driver's license. Everybody should have it, does have it, just to operate, right? It's an operational certification. Versus the CAP accreditation sends us blinded samples. They have people show up on site unannounced to like double check everything. And we have to perform and validate at certain levels across our test menu in order to keep that CAP accreditation. So, we're really trying to check all the boxes. And so, yeah, we have internal validations. Every lab should have them. But we also are doing the extra.
The extra. And for those who don't know, can you define CAP?
Yeah, so it's the College of American Pathologists is the CAP accreditation, which is it's the highest accreditation kind of in laboratory science of what to get. And it's hard to get and it's hard to maintain because it's not like you just get it once and then you have it. You're constantly sent blinded and unblinded tests and having people show up. And we just went through our CAP accreditation in December. And, it's completely unannounced. And all of a sudden, it's just the lab has to be performing at a certain level with a certain level of reproducibility, a certain level of testing validations to be able to get that kind of like seal of approval.
Yeah. So that's for anyone who's looking at labs, like, because in our world, labs crop up periodically. And sometimes they really take hold and kind of take off like Vibrant has. Others come and go and they're not there a couple of years later. And then others they come and they get a little tiny bit of a market share, but they kind of exist a little bit in obscurity, right? And so they don't really kind of mushroom out into the success that it seems like Vibrant has been able to garner since I think you said 2008.
Right.
So I want to respect your time and thank you so much for the time that you have given me. I would like, and maybe we can handle this offline, maybe talking about having you come back and, pick one or two or three of the big tests, like the tick-borne, maybe the total tox test, the neural zoomer, things that do really allow us to zoom in, pun intended, zoom into the clinical picture in certain areas that a lot of practitioners find really challenging. I'd love to have you back to talk about those things.
Sure.
But why don't we close with this? Like, what's on the horizon? I know that you mentioned the urinary test for oxidative stress, which seems to be a few steps beyond where other labs are currently offering.
Right.
What do you anticipate coming out with maybe in the next year? Do you guys have a kind of like a backlog of things that, okay, this is our list to develop, we just haven't gotten to items 2, 3, 4, 5 yet? What does that look like?
Yeah, so the big one right now is the oxidative stress, obviously. And we are going to be also, as I mentioned, kind of starting to pair some genetic panels with our existing panels. So Q4 last year, we paired a toxic genetics to our total tox burden. Coming forward, we're going to do some GI genetics with the gut zoomer. We're going to do some hormone metabolism genetics with the urinary hormone testing. We're going to be bringing in kind of this pairing so that across the test menu, we can start to pair more of those together. We are expanding our cardiogenetic test. So the Cardia X, if you're familiar with that, it was a test originally developed by Mark Houston of all these different cardiogenetic markers. We are expanding that from 21 markers to 60 in those areas of like dyslipidemia, inflammation, hypertension, to help give patients a better idea of how to more successfully, like, let's say, treat hypertension, right? Like, where is it really coming from? Maybe they're not salt sensitive. Maybe there's someone who can totally have salt, but they shouldn't have caffeine or, something of that nature. So those are some of the things that are really, that I know of that are coming down in the pipeline. I'm always, pleasantly surprised when it's, something else is coming. I've heard, various talks about, like I mentioned, the mitochondrial test or telomere testing, but that is going to be like a little bit further off because I know that those are
Right.
not in those later stages of developments like the ones that I just mentioned.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. I think we'll leave it there. And, thank you
Okay.
again for your time. And maybe we can chat as soon as we stop recording about arranging another time for you to come back and share your vast knowledge. It's been a pleasure. I
Absolutely.
really appreciate the time you've given me. And thank you to Dr. Kim Bruno and Vibrant America, Vibrant Wellness.
Very good. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.